Hello and welcome to WePC Benchmarks. My name is Seb and today I'm taking a look at the new Fortnite Season 8 and benchmarking it with 12 GPUs to see how well it performs. The new season has just started and brings with it new map changes, weapons and of course the battle pass. The benchmark is done on Epic settings and on DirectX 12, so with all these changes, how does it do? Well, we start off with the RTX 3090, and at 1080p it averages 213 FPS, with a 1% of 136 FPS and a 0.1% of 88 FPS. Moving up, and at 1440p it gives us an average of 154 FPS, with a 1% of 96 FPS and a 0.1% of 42 FPS. And then at 4K we get an average of 78 FPS, with a 1% of 62 and a 0.1% of 51. Next up is the RX 6900 XT. And at 1080p it averages 263 FPS with a 1% of 162 and a 0.1% of 38. Then at 1440p the card averages 162 FPS with a 1% of 107 and a 0.1% of 7. And then at 4K it averages 83 FPS with a 1% of 48 and a 0.1% of 42. The next GPU is the RTX 3080. And at 1080p it averages 215 FPS with a 1% of 137 and a 0.1% of 24. And then at 1440p, the card averages at 128 FPS, for 1% of 102, and a 0.1% of 37. At 4K, it averages 76 FPS, with a 1% of 59, and a 0.1% of 40. Up next is the RX 6800 XT, and at 1080p, it averages 211 FPS, for 1% of 151, and a 0.1% of 37. Moving up to 1440p, and it averages 144 FPS with a 1% of 97 and a 0.1% of 22. And then at 4K it averages to 81 FPS with a 1% of 45 and a 0.1% of 24. Then is the RTX 3060 Ti. The card averages 135 FPS at 1080p and a 1% of 94 and a 0.1% of 59. Then, up at 1440p, the card averages 89 FPS, with a 1% of 86 FPS and a 0.1% of 55 FPS. And at 4K, it averages to 48 FPS, with a 1% of 39 FPS and a 0.1% of 18 FPS. The RX 6600 XT is next, and at 1080p, the card averages 141 FPS, for 1% of 79 and a 0.1% of 73. Moving up to 1440p, and the card averages 79 FPS for 1% of 39 and 0.1% of 8. Then at 4K, the card averages 35 FPS for 1% of 18 and a 0.1% of 16. Next up is the RTX 2070 Super, and at 1080p, it averages at 138 FPS with a 1% of 83 and a 0.1% of 18. Moving up to 1440p, and it averages 78 FPS for 1% of 60 and a 0.1% of 34. And then at 4K, it averages 42 FPS for 1% of 34 and a 0.1% of 22. Moving on to the RX 5700 XT, and at 1080p it averages 117 FPS for 1% of 65 and a 0.1% of 58. Then at 1440p it averages 80 FPS for 1% of 43 and a 0.1% of 17. And up at 4K, the game averages 43 FPS with a 1% of 21 and a 0.1% of 7. Up next is the RX 580, and at 1080p it averages 64 FPS with 1% of 33 and a 0.1% of 21. Moving up to 1440p, and it averages 35 FPS with a 1% of 16 and a 0.1% of 14. And then at 4K it averages 16 FPS for 1% of 7 and a 0.1% of 7 as well. Then knocking it down to an RX 570, and at 1080p it averages 49 FPS with a 1% of 42 and a 0.1% of 35. Then at 1440p it averages to 31 FPS with a 1% of 22 and a 0.1% of 17. And then at 4K it averages 15 FPS with a 1% of 13 and a 0.1% of 13. The next GPU is the GTX 1050 Ti, and at 1080p it averages 35 FPS with a 1% of 30 and a 0.1% of 18. Moving up to 1440p, it averages 20 FPS with 1% of 17 and a 0.1% of 14. And then at 4K, it averages 10 FPS with a 1% of 4 and a 0.1% of 4 as well. And lastly, we have the GT 1030, and this one I had to stay at 1080p and just adjusted the settings. And so at low, it averages 57 FPS with a 1% of 15 FPS and a 0.1% of 7 FPS. Moving up to medium, and it averages 46 FPS with 1% of 32 and a 0.1% of 16. And then at epic, it only manages 10 FPS on average with a 1% of 5 and a 0.1% of 5 as well. So, there you have it. Unsurprisingly, it is fairly easy to run. As an esports title, they do target most systems they can, and so have quite low requirements. And so with low settings, and setting down resolution scaling, it can run on mostly anything. So, thanks for watching, please like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.